Is Ro Khanna a name you're going to be hearing a lot more of? I'm Olly Mann, this is The Week Unwrapped, and Felicity, what's the story?
Okay, so this week there is a story that pretty much everyone knows, and that's that there's an almighty row brewing, well, already brewed, over in the US over the so-called Epstein files relating to the convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. There's been this talk of a client list of the rich and powerful who knew Epstein, possibly participated in his crimes. Last week, the FBI concluded that there was no evidence of a so-called client list, and Trump, having previously been in favor of releasing all the files, especially when he thought they might implicate the Clintons, has now sort of seemingly backed off and said that everyone should move on.
Doesn't sound like him.
So voters and both Republican and Democrat politicians have pressed Trump to publicly release documents related to the case. And one of the most prominent figures for the Democrats, sort of leading the charge, is this guy called Ro Khanna, who I'm much more interested in talking about. So he tabled an amendment to have the full release of the Epstein files, but they have been blocked.
And he talks in a very persuasive and attractive fashion, as we were just hearing in that clip. He's a compelling speaker, but what else should we know about him, and why does it matter that we pay attention?
Well, I think there's two things to say off the back of the whole Epstein drama to do with Ro Khanna. And one is that he isn't very well known outside of California, where he's a representative for a district that represents Silicon Valley. I sort of see himself rather cynically as attaching himself to the Epstein story to raise his profile. And I think he's doing that because eventually he will make a run for the presidency in 2028. He's been doing lots of rallies. He's been going around the country trying to meet people, trying to talk about what his vision is for the country. And the other thing is that what he's very good at is exploiting divisions amongst the Republicans. So the Epstein story, along with what's going on in the Middle East, is a very contentious and divisive in Republican stories. And he is clearly trying to position himself as attaching his name as someone who is, trying to disrupt what's going on with the Republicans.
Yeah, he's also given an interview this month, Jamie, to the New Statesman. That's not something that average congressional representatives from California...
No, and I think partly he's... he chaired Bernie Sanders' 2020 presidential campaign, and he's certainly very good at tacking himself onto some of the kind of leading lights in the progressive cause. But he obviously knows the appeal of getting good publicity through the internet. I think what's interesting is that if he did run, he would be trying to repeat a feat that's only been achieved once before, and that was to be elected to the White House directly from the House of Representatives.
Is it too early, really, to be thinking about this? Obviously, it's not if you are an American senator or congressman, but for the rest of the world, Harriet, we're still 3 years out from the election. Is it likely we'd be able to predict who's going to be running?
I think that the thing about the American election system, which is so perhaps alien to us, although becoming sadly less alien, is actually just how relevant it is. The way in which a leadership candidate would position themselves to be at the forefront of a race to lead a party like the Democrats, for example, that is a very long process, and it does start even before an election for the next election. So no, I don't think it's too soon to be talking about who might go into the next US election running against potentially Trump, potentially the vice president that we currently are seeing in the US, potentially another MAGA-esque candidate, especially because whoever is trying to position themselves as a candidate for presidential election is already, like Ro Khanna, already making waves in the political sphere. And we can see that as well with other potential candidates. They're trying to raise their profile. They're trying to stay relevant. They're trying to attract donor sponsorship, special advisors. It is absolutely relevant already, I think.
Okay, so who are the runners and riders then, Felicity? Who do you think is looking likely from the Republicans as well as from the Democrats alongside this man?
People are saying that the primary will be the most wide open in at least 20 years, and there are lots of possible people who are running. And actually, in some of the polls, Ro Khanna's name hasn't actually come up yet. I think that's partly, as I was saying, because he isn't so well known. Other people who are much more prominent who are being talked about are Gavin Newsom. Kamala Harris is apparently started attending fundraising gigs, so she might have another go, although I think that would be completely disastrous. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, is talked a lot about. I can't remember the other names, but there are a lot of candidates who are sort of drifting around in the conversation at the moment.
And for the Republicans, is it sort of just JD Vance, really, who's being talked about at the moment, although there's obviously going to be more in reality?
There will be more in reality. Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, I think have been named, but the polling suggests that JD Vance is by far and away the most popular and most prominent.
So if it is Ro Khanna versus Vance, what would Khanna be telling the electorate he has to offer? What's his story, particularly in that context?
Khanna has really pitched himself, I guess, as JD Vance's like nemesis, and they keep on kind of trading barbs on social media, and they're really going up against each other in quite kind of like nasty stuff, I guess, which is really interesting again, because I wonder whether that's part of Khanna's plan, is to be seen as the opposition to the most popular like Republican candidate, which I think is really interesting in and of itself. And he has called Vance a stain on the degree of every Yale graduate and likened him to Stalin. So neither of them are holding back. But to go back to Khanna, so he was born in Philadelphia to Indian immigrant parents. Interestingly, his grandfather was a freedom fighter who was jailed in India for taking part in helping the country gain its independence from the British. I think he was jailed alongside Gandhi, who has had a lot of influence on his political thinking. I think he's a very interesting guy because he's embracing liberal ideas such as Medicare for all, which could be a political liability for some. But on the other hand, he represents Silicon Valley, so he's a big fan of AI and tech and how that can help all of our lives. And very interesting, there's this like phrase that kind of lightheartedly comes up in connection with him, which is blue MAGA.
Sort of like Red Wall, isn't it? It's like the American equivalent of that.
Exactly. It's the idea that he is maybe trying to harness some of the ideas that have been so popular for Trump supporters, like reindustrialization, economic patriotism. And that's something that he's trying to pull the Democrats maybe away from their like obsession and focus on social justice and kind of, you know, woke causes, and bring them back to focusing on like poor people's everyday concerns.
Is there enough there, do you think, Jamie, to appeal to MAGA voters? Because, I mean, when all's said and done, if you're a hardcore fan of Donald Trump, are you ever going to cast a ballot for a brown-skinned Californian congressman?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine a situation in which if he goes up against someone that's anointed by Trump, that he can kind of win over those voters, considering the inroads that Trump made, particularly amongst the black voter in the last election. I mean, he's doing his best, though. He went to South Carolina on tour recently, and his big push, as like Felicity was saying, is about AI and talking about how the racial wealth gap can be bridged if the US government put a lot of money into making sure that the black community know how to use AI and to benefit from it. Ultimately, if he is able to put across this kind of pro-tech, kind of Silicon Valley type message, maybe there's a route into the MAGA vote by basically giving working class or blue collar Americans someone to vote for who's seen as the future.
And maybe there's money as well, Harriet. I mean, that's the other thing. We're talking about like the support of the tech community, like that's important to average voters. The point is, Elon Musk until recently backed Trump, Peter Thiel backs JD Vance. He is the representative of Silicon Valley. If you can get all the other CEOs to back him, there's money in that, and that's how you win.
It's not the only way you win, though. I think that we have to bear in mind that the political system in the US is disproportionately difficult for a Democrat candidate to win. The electoral system broadly favors a Republican candidate. And in the context of MAGA, you can talk about blue MAGA as much as you like, but the MAGA, the vote that Trump and JD Vance harnessed a particular fierce anger, a fury and a frustration and an outrage. That Ro Khanna's brand of sort of progressive positivity, I don't think can in the same way kind of ignite that very, very angry, very frustrated and possibly in certain places quite hateful base. It's not enough to be just the Silicon Valley bro. There are still a lot of Silicon Valley bros that are firmly, firmly behind Trump and will be firmly behind Trump's successor.
But I do think it's very interesting, the mention of Elon Musk, because actually Musk and Khanna do have a bit of a history. And in fact, Musk wrote the preface, I think it was, for one of Khanna's books and said he was like a leading thinker. I think Musk and Khanna have now slightly fallen out a bit, but Steve Bannon is also a fan. Musk in the past has been a fan. So it is interesting. And like, if you tie that into what's going on with the whole Epstein and with the international situation, it's interesting that there is starting to see some kind of crossover, some sort of alliances going on between both sides of the party, which I think is really interesting, particularly when you consider like let's just take a moment to remember and reflect on how bad the Dems are looking right now. Like, their polling shows that the Dems' popularity has actually plummeted even since last year's election. Its support has eroded with white men, Hispanic men, working class voters across the board. Approval ratings sitting below 35% across those demographics. People think the party is out of touch, woke, and weak. And let's remember that they not only lost the presidency, they've lost the House, they've lost the Senate. Like, they are really in the wilderness right now. There is a lot of soul searching. They desperately need to find a leader who can stand up to Trump and Vance. Otherwise, they just don't have a clue of getting back into the political game.
And that means standing up to their own ranks as well, interestingly, doesn't it, Jamie? I mean, you know, as Felicity alluded to earlier, Khanna standing up and saying, let's release the Epstein files. Well, the names that have been circulated around that online, people who were, you know, close associates of Epstein, aren't just people like Trump. They're also Democrats like the Clintons, Bill Gates. You know, you're standing up and saying, let's publish, and that will affect people who donate to the Democrats and who are Democrats too. And I'm separating myself away from that on this cause.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that he's been pushing recently is the anti-war rhetoric, and that the US should prioritise diplomacy and international cooperation over military intervention. And he said he kind of thinks that under Biden, the Democrats kind of lost that wedge narrative, like issue that divides them from the Republicans. And I mean, his main point is that particularly when it comes to things like bombing Iran, a lot of the public, the US public, don't want to be involved in these wars. And he's trying to push the Democrats away from what you would say was kind of the status quo of the last like 4 years, where they've been quite pro-military and pro, in some ways, intervention. So he probably is trying to take some of the same, if we look at the recent success of Zohran Mandami in New York, he's trying to take on some of the similar kind of points to try and revolutionize a party that, as Felicity says, is really in the doldrums.
I think another interesting thing about Khanna and what he's really tapped into is that the Dems need to kind of admit that they were wrong to have Biden run as president. And I think he's trying to be quite bold on that, to say they made a massive mistake and to accept that the part that their party played in Trump's election, to admit that Biden clung on for power too long, to admit that they went too far on social issues, and that Harris won a really, really weak campaign that didn't have any vision and didn't have any substance to it.
To be fair, just to jump in there, I do think it's interesting that we often hear talk of the Democrats should apologize for Trump's victory. And I think that's quite an interesting strand of narrative that you see repeated quite a lot across the board. Like that.
Well, no, but Felicity's saying should apologise for Biden's candidacy.
But we also, I don't believe that we heard the same narrative. For example, after the 2020 election, I don't believe that we heard the same narrative about how many of the Republicans should apologise for putting Trump forward as a candidate for the second time, in which he lost to Biden.
Well, we heard a lot of they need to say that Trump didn't win the last election. That was a thing, wasn't it? They need to say it, and they didn't, basically.
Well, that's different. That strand of narrative was to do with the need for elected officials to admit
tell the
truth and to stand up for democracy and to stand up to effectively a giant lie. I think that is a very different thing than asking a party to sort of continue to self-flagellate over an unsuccessful candidate. And to be honest, we forget now, but there was a very, very big lead up to the election. And during that time, Biden polled extremely well, far better than any of the other front runners for the candidacy. So I do think that
that's even worse. That shows what a terrible state they were in.
I'm not debating the rights or wrongs of having run or tried to run Biden as a candidate for the third time. I think that we can all see the fallacies that were inherent in that. But I think it's important to show the other side as well that there are clearly obvious issues in running Trump as a candidate 3 times too.
It's interesting that they don't want to put Biden up again as the candidate in 2028. I've not read anything about that.
He probably would poll quite well.
But I do think it's alarming that there is talk of Harris, because I think the Dems really need to distance themselves from their ties with the establishment, from their ties with the elites, which I think Khanna is aware of, and I think that's what he's trying to do. And you see that in the speech that he's making about Epstein, which is very, very clever and cunning. So I think it would be a massive mistake to put Harris back up again.
Oh, I agree 100%.